Welcome to the third dimension. The news about new peace being made in Yemen will sound like a broken record. An Omani-mediated agreement between the Houthis and the Saudis could be reached, but it will not be sufficient to end the war. While Saudi Arabia seeks to get out of the war in Yemen and to keep the country away from the Iranian influence, the Houthis seem to utilize the continuation of the truce without truce period to increase their basket gains. Yet, according to my guest, if the Saudi Houthi back-channel talks are not genuinely meant to support the UN-led peace process, they will doubtless face setbacks and the ceasefire will collapse. To investigate the current bilateral Saudi Houthi talks, join me from Berlin, Ibrahim Jallal. Ibrahim is a Yemeni security, conflict and defense researcher. He is currently a non-resident scholar at Middle East Institute. Among his research interests are the United Nations-led peace process in Yemen, the US counter-terrorism strategy, and the rise of the Houthi insurgency. Welcome to the third dimension, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you. If I may start asking you, Ibrahim, what is your own understanding of the current political and military landscape in Yemen?
To begin with, it looks like we've been stuck in a no war, no peace scenario for the past 2 years at least, or since the Houthi offensive on Ma'rib has failed tremendously. And that scenario indicates that we haven't made progress on both military terms, but also political terms, so to speak, of a political resolution, a negotiated one under the UN auspices between the government of Yemen on one front and the Houthis on the other. And as we saw the truce that came about last April, following the Houthis' failure to capture Ma'rib, but also the Saudi-led coalition's interest to not only pursue a drawdown, which we saw in 2019 and 2020, and that intensified, but also seeking a way out to focus on internal development as well as regional matters and the management, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic that brought with it unprecedented level of shock and disruptions, not only to these countries, but also the supply chain globally. And following the collapse of the truce in October, I think there might have been an interest to revive the trajectory of back-channel talks in a level unprecedented before, mainly between Saudis and the Houthis. We've seen about 2 to 3 Omani visits to Sana'a in October, and then again in December and in January. And there were reports of Saudi visits in the beginning of this year. And should that have been the case, it would have been the first visit, so to speak, of direct communication on matters related to the truce. And the scope of issues that are being discussed at the moment are more than any time before. In the past, the Saudi Houthi talks mainly focused on border security, matters related to the Houthi ballistic missile and drone capability, and de-escalation measures. But this one in particular includes also talks about the payment of salaries for civil security and military servants, including Houthi fighters. And this is unprecedented, so to speak, of the scope of the talks, because it's a matter that the government of Yemen should discuss rather than regional stakeholders or other parties, if not the United Nations envoy Hans Grunberg.
Okay. So Ibrahim, if we would like to elaborate more on this bilateral talks, okay, your previous analysis published in April 15th, 2020, entitled Saudi Arabia Eyes Exit in Yemen, but Saudi Houthi talks alone won't resolve the conflict. In that paper, Ibrahim, if you still remember, you argued that Saudis were engaged with direct talks previously with Houthis only to secure what we call a face-saving exit. Now the question is, Is it the same face-saving exit dilemma that makes the Saudis engaged in direct talks with Houthis now?
Peace, like war, has a price, but the price of war is much more, tremendous. And the calculations that existed in 2020 April, and at that particular time, if you all remember, it was the pandemic hitting globally. We had, disruption and imposition of curfews and a ban on travels without the vaccinations. So at the time, we also had the Emiratis announce their drawdown from Yemen, and there was a sense of abandonment coupled with the consequences of a 6-7 year intervention at that point that, the geography of Yemen's map absolutely reflect. So there was a sense of importance at the UN level to push for a ceasefire at that point for, pandemic measures. And at the same time, that was parallel with the Saudi interest, of course, to reach a way out and sort of restore an intra-Yemeni direct dialogue. But that didn't work. And it didn't work. Mainly the Houthis thought they had the upper military hand in Yemen after capturing Al Jawf just a month ahead. That was in March 2020.
Yes.
And that was the first thing. So the Houthis were not as interested. They thought they could achieve more militarily and by avoiding talks. So they didn't engage in the ceasefire announced at that point. They didn't also engage in the ceasefire announced in the following year. And instead they published a wish list of demands, which they called the Vision for Peace. And that includes many provisions, of which some of which are ambitious if we look at it, and does not necessarily, include the rest of Yemeni stakeholders. So there is mismatch in expectations on the sides of the Houthis, more particularly. On the sides of Saudis, the Saudis now 2 years on, or 3 years on, actually, they're willing to give more than they were willing in the past. And these calculations, especially with the establishment of the Presidential Leadership Council, are going to be a long way, because at the end of the day, whatever tactical agreements or even strategic between Saudis and the Houthis, an intra-Yemeni dialogue have to unfold eventually, unless that's influenced by the same dynamics on back channel talks. Yeah. Then we could expect something different.
Okay. Now, Ibrahim, if we move to your second analysis, which was published in February 15th, 2023, just this month, Ibrahim, and in which you say Saudi Houthi talks could pave the way for intra-Yemeni ones, but will they ensure sustainable peace? Now, in this paper, Ibrahim, again, you talk about the possibility of such bilateral talks to be paving the way for what we call an intra-Yemeni dialogue. How is that possible? And before you answer, Ibrahim, I will just bring in a lady from International Crisis Group who has commented on the same issue. Let's watch together.
The reality of the situation, that the Saudi and Houthi talks, as you've rightly said, they're nothing new and they will happen. And, even past Houthi and Saudi talks, the UN has picked up from that. And I think a lot of the international community and Western diplomats, they see great progress that these talks are taking place. So I think we can admit the progress that these talks are taking place, but at the same time have a realization that this is not enough.
Okay. So what do you make out of this, Ibrahim?
The talks are absolutely not new. They've happened in 2016. They've happened in 2019 with the announced escalation, in 2020 and throughout this year, just at different intensities and paces. And the progress, I think, is measured by the tangible, outcomes that we see, rather than the hype of the talks happening themselves. Because at the end of the day, we measure impact by what happens as an extension of these talks. And so far, we have yet to see tangible progress on that front. with regards to Houthi-Saudi talks. Of course, the international community sees a benefit, mainly because the UN mediated truce, which was also backed by the Sultanate of Oman and Saudi Arabia. So if eventually fall after the second renewal, and that was a question we posed in Amman when we were in the UN public figures consultations back in May, what is after the truce? And mainly because there was no clear vision, but also no practical, map that multiple parties could agree upon, we saw it collapse. And then that brought, an even greater sense of Saudis to step up their diplomatic communications with the Houthis and discuss an alternative proposal that, might speak to some of the Houthi conditions. Because at the moment, the Houthis condition their engagement on intra-Yemeni talks on the Houthi, on Saudis achieving some of their demands at least. And that's where we stand at the moment. Talks remain highly, confidential in terms of scope and progress. But we know some of these issues,
Yes.
and a breakthrough remains in the wait. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take some time, or even if it's reached as in terms of tactical understanding in the run-up to the 8th anniversary of the Arab Coalition's intervention on March 26, which is about 4 or 5 weeks away from now, or maybe a couple months afterwards. And then the big question comes: how are these tied to the broader framework of intra-Yemeni talks? How regional actors support the United Nations-led, talks, and that's and this calculation takes in place the assumption that the Houthis would be and Saudis would reach some sort of understanding on the key issues that the Houthis are conditioning, obviously.
Okay.
And of course, we can't divorce the Iranian calculations and the stalled GCPO talks and the ramping up sanctions in the EU, given the Iranian supply of drones and military equipment, as well as advisors for the Russians in the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. Okay, we'll talk about the Iranian influence in the Yemeni crisis later, Ibrahim. But if I may reframe again my question, and I may remind you with the International Group Crisis Report's famous report that was published on the 29th of December, will Houthi-Saudi talks make or break Yemen? Now, they argue in that paper, Ibrahim, or in that report, that anti-Houthi factions are not included in this bilateral talks, and therefore we do not expect any breakthrough to happen.
Yeah, they're not included, and that's a fact. The government and the actors, armed groups, and political, parties and entities that make up the Presidential Leadership Council, but also others who are not included, are not part of these talks. We know that for sure, and it's fairly and naturally common sense to say that if the main and original parties to the conflict are not, in talks, we cannot expect a major breakthrough. But at the same time, that said, given the level of influence of regional actors, in particular on one party, which is the government of Yemen here, how do these talks translate into direct and indirect pressure to actually make concessions? If we look into the PLC, into the announcement of the transfer of powers, I think 7th provision, if I remember correctly, which says the objective of the PLC is to reach an agreement with the Houthis via, dialogue, basically. The question is, how do these talks complement or lead or influence the direction of future talks? And that's one question. The second, and it's if we look at the structure of the PLC and the actors that are represented, it's very obvious that there are multiple agendas, and some of these are not, necessarily complementary. They don't complement each other.
Yeah.
And until that is found, it's highly likely that the agenda of the PLC, when it goes to form its negotiating committee to talk with the Houthis, when and if the Houthis are open any soon, it's not going to be easy. There might be structural setbacks within that one front, which must be harmonized with a common vision, at least for the next 5 years, and genuine, concessions and understandings within the PLC and its, bigger elephants in the room should be reached ahead of these talks, obviously.
Okay. Now, Ibrahim, if we just track the history of Houthis with negotiations, you say in one of your reports that Houthis do not honor their agreements, okay? They have never shown even the bare minimum of good faith by agreeing to previous agreements. How then, the question, should we judge the merit of such back-channel parleys between the Houthis and the Saudis? And again, I will just, we will watch again a clip for Professor Elizabeth Kendall from Oxford University commenting on the same issue.
You're right, the Houthis did not keep their promises under the truce. And it was true that Sana'a airport reopened, perhaps not to the extent that the Houthis had hoped, but the Houthis were supposed to open roads around Taiz. They didn't, and they kept stalling. And then they said, well, we won't open these roads, we'll open these other roads, very minor roads, which didn't really help the situation or would not have helped. And every time the Houthis were given a concession, they simply wanted more.
Yeah, what do you make of Professor Kendall's talk?
I think Kendall captures Houthi negotiations tactic very accurately.
Yes.
The more they get, the next move is to push, and test how deep the water is to secure further concessions. We saw that happen in Hodeidah with the Stockholm Agreement when the coalition-backed joint forces, mainly Tihama forces and the Giants, and then backed by Tariq Saleh forces at the end, when they, sieged the city of Hodeidah, a UN truce followed, and that tactical advantage, or strategic advantage rather, even was used to the Houthis' favor, that the demining, for example, of Hodeidah ports did not proceed, that the payment of salaries from fuel coming via Hodeidah ports were not used for the payment, of civil servants. There've been, a long track record, which also Professor Kendall tackled on that front, and that of course adds more confusion and doubt on what can be achieved via dialogue should the distribution of power and influence not be changed, and of course that emphasizes the centrality of this question. Will we see an escalation, a military one, to shape the future trajectory of the conflict or even peace? And it's highly likely that we will, just in more non-conventional ways that could hamper and affect the resources of the government, which we saw happen last year. And that's, another mode of warfare. Another one would be the assumption of violence, mainly to capture the oil and gas in Ma'rib should the Houthis fail to generate some of the concessions that they want to secure in these back channel talks with regards to the payment of salaries for their fighters particularly, and to be managed by them in foreign currency.
Okay.
The question of trustworthiness and engagement in good faith is an important one. And after 8 years, it only is right, for Yemeni stakeholders and those involved in negotiations directly and indirectly to actually look to the humanitarian suffering, to the cost of war that has, settled on most of our population. So it's not a fantasy to assume that some of the negative things that happened in the past wouldn't happen, but with actors disruptive enough who've been spoilers would act differently in a way that put the interests of our people in the Republic of Yemen above all of this. And we have yet to see that happening, especially from the Houthis.
Okay. Now, in case a deal reached, Ibrahim, what implications would such a deal have on the Saudis, the Houthis, and the anti-Houthi factions? And before you comment on this, I will just remind our audience by the main issues that these bilateral talks focus on. Yes, Ibrahim, we're talking about the implications of such a deal if it is reached, either on the Saudis, on the Houthis, and on the anti-Houthi factions. Briefly, please.
Yes, I might have not heard the intervention, but there are multiple implications, of course. One on the Houthi, on the Houthis, one of the first impacts that it would have, or the implications, is that it obviously, if it tackles the financial component or the economic, it would increase the resources of the Houthis, which have of course implications on local alliances and the ability to mobilize and launch further large-scale military offensives in several parts of the country. The second implication is that it would increase the significance of back-channel talks, not only with Saudis, but also other international stakeholders who might be interested in, of course, ramping up the diplomatic engagement, including back-channel, to figure out alternatives or, channels that, quote-unquote, support the UN-led peace process, but also to secure concessions and also break the isolation that we've been seeing. As for Saudi Arabia, the primary implication would be in decreasing physical cross-border threats in the forms of ballistic and cruise missiles, low altitude flying drones, which have been disruptive enough and reached as far as Riyadh, but also the naval, mines and little booby trap boats that have been used to attack some maritime facilities, including those commercial in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
The second, for Saudi Arabia, it will also, strategically position itself for a post-Yemen or a post-war Yemen landscape where its communication with all stakeholders and actively engaged political parties, but also armed groups, means that it has ways to de-escalate with also influence, which has been a position long held in the past couple of decades, given geographical proximity. And finally, on the government camp, or what's also called as the non-Houthi front.
Yes.
It will have multiple implications. The first implication, it will emerge as the weaker party, mainly because its ally has decided to embark on a deal trajectory with its rival.
Yeah.
And second of all, it would have to deal with the division of ideas and visions that the members of the PLC, who represent multiple actors, have.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be easy. to actually negotiate, then you would have a shared understanding on strategic priorities, on a number of things. These include the shape of the state, the political system, the distribution of wealth and power, among other issues, obviously. And that has yet to be seen.
Okay. Now, Ibrahim, finally, if I may just ask you a question away from this debate about it. It's a kind of personal question. Now, being a Yemeni intellectual in diaspora there in Europe, I usually host international experts to comment on Yemeni issues. This time I'm hosting a Yemeni researcher commenting on Yemeni crisis. What role do you play as a Yemeni researcher to change, I would say, fallacious ideas about the crisis, about the conflict to the international community? Briefly, please.
Like my colleagues, I think researchers, human rights specialists, and generally activists play a significant role in clarifying some of the messages about the overall situation, debunking some of the fallacies or narrative hijacking processes that we see in multiple ways. And that's not only part of personal commitment, but also moral obligation. So as if we wanted to envision a sustainable peace process in the country based on noble values of humanity, social justice, democratic governance, transparency and accountability, but above all, equality for all Yemenis.
Thank you so much for your time and expertise. It was a real pleasure having you, Ibrahim. See you next time on Yemen Today TV.
Pleasure, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's all for this time. See you next week with a new edition of The Third Dimension.